as we close this series that we've been in, Growing Pains. It's been a series of conversations where we've really named this reality that we all face, which is that growth in our lives often goes hand in hand with discomfort and challenge and facing the unknowns. And so that first week, we talked about how anytime something new is coming into our life, there is also going to be the discomfort that comes with outgrowing the old, outgrowing things that no longer serve us or can hold us. And then that next week, Kathleen invited us to see the metaphor of the garden and how the growing pains of the garden show us that as we grow, it's a process that takes time. It's a process that often happens through trial and error, that even failure is a part of the growth. We talked about how we are all wounded healers, meaning the greatest gifts that we give to the world often go hand in hand with the very same things that we have suffered through or struggled with. Founder of Aldea, Kevin Skinner, came to talk to us about change and transformation. Not just the transformation that has happened in the history of this community, but how we are all invited to a type of transformation that can be so disorienting and so scary, and yet we know it is for our good, and so we blaze forward anyway. We talked about how, for many of us, the growing pains that we have experienced around spirituality have been the leaving behind and letting go of certainty. And then we moved on to talk about how perhaps emotionally, we've begun to recognize that as we grow, instead of being afraid of the things that scare us, the things that cause pain, the things that come into our lives unannounced and we only want to run, but maybe we can turn towards those things and we can lean into them for all the gifts they have to offer us, which, by the way, is very much the core theme of this book, the unexpected good news about anxiety, panic, and fear. You're going to have to come back next week to understand what that good news is, because that sounds like a bit of a cliffhanger, right? And then we had a special guest, Benji, speak to us a few weeks ago about the price of authenticity, right? That so many of us in the journey of becoming authentic and being truly ourselves have faced the growing pains of that. And then finally, last week, we talked about pruning. That in order to grow in one direction, we may have to let go of some other possible avenues of life. In order to fully say yes, we also have to say no. And so I look back at this whole series that we've been in, and one of the things that really stands out to me is that life is hard, right? Life is challenging. Life is full of unknowns. And yet through each of these difficulties, we are also offered the opportunity to grow. I look around at, the beautiful desert landscape that we are also privileged to live in, at least unless you're visiting here, well, welcome. But, if you live here, right, we're surrounded by cacti in almost every direction. And I think these plants are such a powerful reminder that even with hard sun, even with minimal water, that they have found a way to thrive in their environment. And I know if they can, then we can too, right? That we can thrive through the growing pains of life. And so as we close this series out, I really wanted to kind of hone in on what I find to be one of the most challenging and yet most fruitful parts of the growth process in life, one of the most potent growing pains we may experience. And that is the opportunity that we are all given when it's time for us to take accountability, right? This is the heart behind that video we showed, that there are always going to be moments in our lives when we are given the opportunity to take accountability in our lives. Because all of us have things that we are unaware of or things that we might be unwilling to look at. And accountability is this invitation to embrace and acknowledge the truth, as painful as it might be in a certain situation. I call these truth bombs. Has anyone ever faced a truth bomb where just the truth enters into your life and it kind of leaves some wreckage in its midst, but it's also inviting something new, a new awareness, a new truth. I was thinking about a truth bomb that I experienced, many years ago. I was 20 years old, and I was sitting down with my mom. We were having a conversation, and, she looked at me and she said, Jake, I need to tell you something. And I said, what is it? And she said, you have bad breath. And I asked, right now? And she said, no, in general. And it was a bit of a difficult pill to swallow. It was a bit of a truth bomb, because it's one thing for someone to say, like, you have spinach in your teeth. It's another thing for someone to say, you've had a piece of spinach in your teeth for 20 years. And so there are moments where it's challenging, right? It hurts. The truth can hurt. As Gloria Steinem, the activist, said, truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. Anyone felt this before, right? The truth hurts, and in many ways it hurts because it comes as a challenge to the perspective that we were holding, right? It comes as a challenge to the reality that we were living in. They say ignorance is bliss. And so often truth comes in to tear us away from that bliss. And we all know that feeling. And though it might be painful in the moment, we can probably all look back and say that we're glad. We're glad for those invitations. That whether it's truth coming from deep within, perhaps it's truth coming from others, those you trust, or perhaps it's truth coming from a source that you could only describe as the universe or spirit or God, that we know that these invitations show up in our lives. And in many ways, what they're doing is they are pointing out the gap between where we are and where we want to be in life, right? There's a gap that often shows up. When I was a kid, I loved going on roller coasters, and I haven't been on a serious roller coaster in probably over 5 years now, and I'm not sure if my 32-year-old body is even able to handle that anymore, right? I don't know, and I haven't tested it, but as a kid, I loved roller coasters, and the problem is that there was an age in which I wanted to go on all these amazing roller coasters, and I was not yet tall enough, so I had to go and stand against that podium, and it says, you must be tall enough to ride this ride, and I remember this period of my life in which there was a gap between where I was and where I wanted to be. Yet when I think about the growing pains of life, I feel that they offer us an invitation to begin to close that gap, that when we feel the uncomfortability, that we're being stretched in life, we're being invited to grow, that though it is painful, that we are also being invited to ultimately bridge that gap. But it starts with the willingness to face that there is a gap. And that, friends, I believe is where accountability comes in. Are we willing to acknowledge the gap between who we currently are and maybe who we want to be, or who we the ideals, the goals, the values that we say with our lips, right? Maybe we haven't lined that up. See, there are many weeks where I may get on stage, I may share a particular message about a certain topic. I may encourage us to try some things, right? And then that same week, I fall flat on my face in those very same areas, right? I'm often not taking my own advice, right? Because sometimes, especially when it comes to our internal world, our spirituality, which is so personal, the only person that we're truly accountable to is ourselves. And the problem when we are only accountable to ourselves is that at times things slip, things drift. Our habits don't necessarily always reflect our ideals or our goals. We can often get isolated, and without realizing it, we end up in a different place than we want to be. This is why I find that working from home or those who are self-employed, it's actually a lot harder than it sounds. Anyone work from home here? Okay, anyone would say it's actually a lot harder than people think it is, right? That people have okay. Well, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about there's been this rise in something called co-working spaces. You know what a co-working space is, right? These businesses where they have buildings where you can go, and even if you work from home, even if you are a self-employed person, you can simulate the experience of co-working, right? Now, there are many of you who would say, back in my day, we used to just call that work, right? But it's this new thing, and I think what it really is doing for a lot of people is it's giving the experience of being in others' presence, being in physical proximity with others. And I think what this does for us is it's this realization that being around other people who are kind of working alongside you, even if they're doing something different, just being around people who are trying to accomplish something, and certainly being guided by others, being mentored by others, the presence of other people in our lives is one of the main ways that we keep ourselves from drifting from where we want to be to an entirely different endpoint. The way I was visualizing it this week, and I don't know if this is totally crazy, but I was just imagining, like, what if you took your child to kindergarten, okay, first day of kindergarten, and the teacher hands you basically like a shipping container's worth of tests and projects and assignments, and they say to you, okay, we'll see you back here in 13 years for graduation, right? Good luck. We probably know that wouldn't go all that well, because there's something about being in the presence of teachers and being in the presence of classmates and being in the presence of a structure that keeps us accountable, right? Think back when you were in grade school and all the times where, being around other people or having a teacher gave you some motivation or gave you some guidance or even just redirected you when you had lost your way. Right? This is just an example. It's an example of how structure is not always a bad thing. It can create accountability in our lives. See, I believe that life in many ways functions like a school because we're always given the opportunity to learn lessons every single day. Right? Lessons that seem to increase in difficulty as time goes on. Am I right? And without accountability, sometimes we find ourselves drifting away from where we want to be. Right? The picture that comes in my head is almost like a swim lane for lap swimmers. And I'll be honest, I have never swam in a lap pool because when I go in the pool, I like to have complete freedom to do my own thing, which is usually some kind of thrashing. I'm not a lap pool kind of person. But if I were to ever swim in a lap pool, I know that the boundaries and the edges and the lane would be essential for me, because knowing the way I do things, without the lane edge, it would be all of 15 seconds before I would have collided with Janet on my left, right? No one? Okay. And no one's picturing this. I feel like it's a funny image if you could just picture it. Picture Jake in a lap pool. And I feel like even if the lane is there, I'm still going to end up colliding with someone. But anyway, all right, first service like that. This is the first time I'm going to bring in first service and compare you. I'm sorry. First service like that one better. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that. Life is a long swim. Life is a journey. And what can happen is if we lose that accountability, we also end up just not going in the direction that we want to go in. John C. Maxwell is an author and speaker on the topic of leadership. He says, without accountability, we drift. With it, we thrive. Right? We drift or we thrive. And often accountability shows up in the form of people in our lives who remind us what our values or what our goals are, that sometimes without those voices speaking into our lives, we forget, right? We don't necessarily match our behavior with our values. Sometimes accountability shows up in the form of boundaries or edges that let us know we've drifted because we sometimes run up against a wall. And I think accountability really shows up when we have the awareness, and maybe even more importantly, when we have the trust in ourselves, trust in God, or however you choose to name it, when we have the trust to say that, if I just stay open, if I pay attention, right, the truth will find me. Wisdom will show up when I need it. That I will be able to trust that something deep within me will show me when there is a green light and when there is a red light, when something is for me and when something is not. See, how many of us know that sometimes, without intending to, you can take a wrong turn and end up on the wrong path, right? And it could take a long time to even realize you've gone off track. Anyone ever felt like this before, right? Perhaps sometimes you're taking on a task or a project, or you have a certain goal, and you're just doing something the wrong way. And it can be incredibly helpful for someone to point out, hey, maybe actually you want to do it like this. And it could save you a lot of work and a lot of time down the road. Even failure can be a gift because it says, hey, this didn't work, try something different. Sometimes we have the best of intentions and something just wasn't right. Maybe the timing, maybe the person, maybe some aspect of the situation. When I was 8 years old, I have this memory. I was in a McDonald's in Hawaii because if you're going to go to Hawaii, you might as well try the local cuisine. And I was in this McDonald's, and me and my mom are standing in line, figuring out what we're going to want to order, and then I decided to go to the bathroom, and I came back, and I found my mom in line. She was still in line, and, I was just feeling the love. I'm in Hawaii. I'm about to get an Egg McMuffin. Things were feeling good for my 8-year-old self, and so I just put my arm around my mom. I pulled her real close, and I looked back at the menu, and I decided what I was going to get, and then I looked at her, and as it turned out, it was not her. It was another woman, and I shrieked a little bit, and I kind of went, and then I was like, I'm so sorry, and the reality of that situation was the intentions were good, right? It was just the wrong person. Sometimes you've been in this situation before, right? You have the right heart, the right intention for something, and the timing wasn't there, right? The situation wasn't exactly right for you. And so when we come up against a boundary or edge, right? And in the case of my story, the boundary was just social etiquette, right? You don't just hug random people, I suppose. I don't know, in Hawaii, it might be a little different, but I just felt like it was weird. But these moments can be a gift. They can be useful for us if we let them. It can be hard, though, too. I know for me, I find myself to be a very sensitive person, and I can take it very, very personally when accountability is offered to me. Often, I want to run away instead of face the thing that I need to take accountability for. Just this morning, I was leaving the house. My partner, Olivia, she looks at me and she says, there is an oil stain on the counter. Do you know anything about this? Would you have anything to do with this? And my first thought was like, deny. No way, I couldn't possibly know. And then I looked within myself, and I remembered that I had been eating peanut butter on the counter, and I'm not off the counter, but it was my fault, if I'm being honest. And so that second impulse, after denying, the second impulse was to say to her, I didn't say this, but I wanted to say to her, I'm going to move to Poland, and you will never have to deal with oil on the countertops again. I'll see you later, right? That was because I tend to want to run rather than face accountability, right? But if you're like me, and this is hard for you, okay, if we can just stay open, if we can quiet the ego, perhaps we can see accountability as something that is ultimately there to benefit us. It is an opportunity for growth. It is an opportunity to move into something better. Now, the reality is that you may be facing something in your life that is a lot more dire and a lot more serious than an oil stain on the counter. You may be struggling deeply with a situation. You may be confused at the direction that your life is taking. You may look at your life and say, I did all the right things. I did everything I was supposed to do. Why is it still not adding up? Why are things still not making sense? The reality is, friends, that sometimes life is just plain hard. It really just is. And if we stay open, right, if we can quiet that ego that so often wants to defend and run, then perhaps we would be willing to look at some of the blind spots. Perhaps we would be willing to invite the wisdom of others, those who care about us, to say, hey, when accountability is being offered, maybe it's there for my benefit. Sometimes it doesn't just show up as the voice of another. Sometimes it shows up as a voice deep within. I like to call this the still small voice, because sometimes truth and accountability can show up as a gentle nudge from deep within your heart. Maybe it's saying things like, hey, I know that this situation is difficult, and I know you're so angry at what they did, but is there anything you could take responsibility for on your end, right? Maybe it's saying things like, hey, I know that you so desperately want to grow spiritually, but is there some way that you could be better using your time? Are there a practice that you should really be doing? Or maybe it's saying something like, hey, I know you really want that ice cream, but remember you are lactose intolerant. Okay, don't forget that. Anyway, I've had that still small voice before, and I've often ignored it. But sometimes it comes from others, sometimes it comes from within, and then there are times where accountability shows up in a way that is undeniable, that you can only describe it as cosmic accountability, as if the voice of God or the universe itself is showing up in your life in an undeniable way and offering some accountability, right? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe you do, but if you don't, I'll give you an example of something that happened in our culture earlier this summer that I believe is a good example of cosmic accountability. You may know this story, but if you don't, there was a Coldplay concert. Okay, and this happened earlier this summer. There was a Coldplay concert, and if you don't know the band Coldplay, popular band, arenas around the world, and there was a portion during the concert in which on the Jumbotron, they were going from couple to couple and kind of having these different sweet moments between couples. And then at one point, they end up focusing this camera on a couple, and things did not go as planned. I'll let the clip speak for itself.
Yeah. Oh, look at these two. All right, come on. You're okay? Oh, what? Either they're having an affair or they're just very shy. I'm not quite sure.
Okay, as it turns out, they were having an affair. These are two married people having an affair, and they were actually both very, very high up in a tech company called Astronomer. The male was the CEO of this big company, and the woman was the head of HR. And so this situation went viral overnight, right? And ultimately it led to just this massive kind of viral thing where ultimately the two of them both ended up resigning from their jobs, and it kind of wrecked their life. But there's also this rumor going around that it's possible that the guy, the CEO, was considering suing Coldplay. Now, I think this is a good example of the lengths that we often go to avoid accountability, even when it's being hand-delivered to us, even when it's undeniable. Sometimes we still want to avoid, right? The idea of suing Coldplay when your affair is being exposed, I think, captures this. And I know that probably very few of us have actually tried to sue Coldplay before, right, in this room. But even still, we know that feeling of wanting to desperately avoid accountability at all costs, right? And we can be honest with ourselves about it. And we can relate, right? We know it's being a human's hard, and sometimes acknowledging that which feels unacknowledgeable is some of the worst pain that we can feel. Right, so unfortunately, this couple ended up going through. Well, actually, I shouldn't call them a couple, right? That's not. They were not a couple. I mean, they shouldn't have been. But they ended up going through kind of that thing which we tend to call cancel culture, right? Where in our culture, it's so easy to pass judgment, and we tend to lack the compassion for something that someone else might go through. And I think it's a great example of this complex thing that we call cancel culture, this change in society where information and technology has become so readily available that we have certainly an increase in accountability, right? Like this was actually something they were doing that was destructive and harmful to their lives, and so they were not able to get away with it like they might have been able to 20 years ago before the internet and before Jumbotrons. I don't know when Jumbotrons were invented, but you have this increase in accountability that is certainly a part of our culture today, but there has been a notable decrease in compassion. Because just as the internet has allowed us to see things that were previously hidden, it has also distanced us from our fellow humans, right? And we know innately, and I think Krista Tippett, host of the On Being podcast, captures this really well, accountability without compassion is cruelty, right? Because true accountability, loving accountability, it cares about everyone involved in a circumstance, that it has the capacity to not only care for the victims, but to care for the perpetrators, to invite them into growth, right? To see a path of restoration for even the one causing harm. Right? That true accountability is not about excommunicating or canceling someone forever. And when we dip into that behavior in many ways, we are emulating a God of judgment that I know most of us no longer believe in. And so the important thing for us to do is to balance accountability with compassion, to balance accountability with grace. And I wonder if the only way that we can really do this is to try to work on having a heart and a mind that can live in the tension between the two. Right? It's a bit of a paradox, and it requires nuance. And how many of us know that we live in a society that is lacking in nuance, that is lacking in that ability to live in the tension between two realities that seem in contradiction with one another? I find that one of the best ways that we can try to have more nuance, that we can balance compassion and accountability is in community, is in a community like this. Because when we are in community, when we allow other people to speak into our lives, we are allowing ourselves to be seen as we are. We are allowing vulnerability into our lives. And I know, at least I've experienced this in my life, that vulnerability is very, very hard, if not impossible to do on your own, right? Without other people. And so we are made better by being in community, by inviting that accountability. There's a verse in the ancient Hebrew scriptures as part of the wisdom text of Proverbs. You may know this one, Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. Anyone heard this one before, right? It's a bit of a classic. Not that many of you. Okay. I grew up in a type of church where this was often used as like the hyper masculine verse, like, come to the men's barbecue, iron sharpens iron, you know. Okay. All right. Just going to throw that one out there, you know. Who knows who that landed on, but I'll give some context for this. This verse came out of a time in history that we would call the Iron Age. That iron was the predominant material for which weapons were made, for which all kinds of building tools and everything was made out of iron at that point. And this is past the Bronze Age. This is past the Stone Age. And what is particularly significant about that is that if you were to go and sharpen iron on stone or wood, you would end up breaking the stone, breaking the wood. It wouldn't be of any use to the iron. Even if you were to try to sharpen iron on bronze, it would ultimately end up wearing away the bronze, right? You must sharpen iron with something of equal strength. And what I find to be so poignant about this is that I genuinely believe that when we are in community, when we are allowing each other to be seen by one another, truly seen, that we make each other better. When we are willing to speak into each other's lives, even when it feels risky, even when it feels scary. When we open ourselves up to vulnerability, to allow others to tell us the truth, even when it's hard. Right? This is iron sharpening iron. It's one of my favorite things when people tell me that Aldea has been a place of belonging, or a place where they feel safe, or a place where they grow, right? And I know that ultimately, that their experience does not come down to the music, although thank you, Dennis, and it does not come down to the meditation, although thank you, Roger, and it does not come down to the speaker. Ultimately, if someone experiences belonging, growth, inspiration here at Aldea, it is because they showed up with an open heart and were surrounded by others who had the same. Others who were also pursuing a life of values and a life of love with a similar sincerity. That is what makes a community like this special. It is the iron sharpening iron. And it's important if we're going to approach this and really live this out, it's important to remember that if you are on the other side of accountability, if you are ever going to offer accountability to someone, it's important to remember that accountability is not about finger pointing. It is not about judgment. It is a team sport, friends. It is something where we are on the same team, and we must remember that we are here to support each other, not to cast each other out, not to put each other down. This is an important reframe that I think whatever side of accountability you find yourself on, right? That I really believe that this reframe is essential for us. Accountability is not a judgment, it is an invitation to growth. It is not a demand, it's an opportunity. Because friends, ultimately you decide whether something that comes in as truth and as accountability, you decide if it resonates or not. You get to decide if that's something that you are going to follow up on or not. Because a day will come where someone is going to offer what they think of as accountability or offer truth to you, and it may not resonate for you. You might say, that's not actually for me. Can we trust ourselves to know truth when it arises and to know something that is not for us and to be able to filter between the two? Accountability requires great trust in one another, but it also requires great trust in ourselves. And really, in many ways, this I feel like is what the whole series of Growing Pains has been about. It's been about trust. It's been about trusting that when the growing pains of life come, that they are for our good. It's about trusting ourselves that we all carry the innate wisdom and tools and resources we need to move through growth and not be broken by it. It's that trust we have in community to look around at even a room, the room we're in right now, and to know that we are not alone as we grow and as we face the challenges of life. May we stay compassionate with ourselves and with others throughout this process. And ultimately, may we not be afraid for when change and discomfort and upheaval come, that they are also showing us that something new and something more for us is arising in our midst.